As you can see, I'm in the paddock today. My happiest time in a paddock full of Zimbabwe cows. Not quite right, but close. I'll tell you about that later. Last week, Jabu started work at the prisons department, and he did pretty well. He met a new friend, an Irishman called Aidan, and Aidan got fired. Oh, why on earth I put an Irishman into the context, I don't know. My accent is terrible, but I do use them to differentiate the conversation. Otherwise, it becomes hard to understand. I apologize in advance to all Irish people. Aidan had helped him, and he went forward and really resolved a tricky situation with some wormy sudza that the prisoners had objected to. He also heard about a trial that James Chikarema was involved in, and then he suddenly met a man called Michael Mawema, who said he'd heard all about the wormy sudza, and they had things to talk about. That comes later. So here we go. When he got home that evening, Jabu found a letter from his father. It said there was to be a big sale of the family's Thule cattle next weekend, and Jabulani was needed. Would he fulfill his obligation to his family and help prepare for this important event by taking Friday off? He knew he had to go, but he was agitated about letting down his work, and even more important, the SRANC and Mr. Mawema. But it was fine, because when he asked Mr. Eddington, his boss was happy to let him go. So on Thursday afternoon after work, he waited at the station for the bus to take him back to Ntabazinduna. He was thinking about what he'd have to do once he arrived, but he was actually more than anything very excited, because he knew he would see his beautiful Bongani once again. She is a new and very lovely development for Jabu. The bus was late, so he waited and thought about Bongani. And he remembered his last visit to his Babankulu. He'd made a special visit because Bongani had spoken to her father, Mandla, about the need to go to school and the offer to stay at Ntabazinduna. There were tears and unhappiness as the old man's shoulders sagged. Bongani understood the unspoken words. She'd written a melancholy letter to Jabu saying she did indeed love him, but she couldn't leave her father. Tears had dropped onto the paper, smudging the bright blue quink ink. Jabu remembered his own tears had been pretty close when he read it. Then he had a good idea, so he made a special visit to Ntabazinduna and spoke for hours with his grandfather about the pride he had in his Thule herd. Jabu had never really thought about them. They were just a cattle, even though they were very strong, and their coats shone brown and black and sometimes even dark red in the sunshine. And they produced good meat. About 10 years ago, the native commissioner asked me to start a project where we crossed our African cattle with those big red Herefords that you see on the white farms, his father told him. It was a new thing for me, but the NC made me think how strong our cattle are in the heat, how they don't seem to need water even in the drought. Jabu had listened with interest, adding that they were more resistant to ticks and disease too. Quite right, yeah, quite right, his grandfather said. The NC said mixing the breeds was producing beautiful cows. They were taking all the prizes in the Bulawayo and Salisbury show and are giving resistance to heat and disease to the Hereford. The Herefords, in return, give our cows more weight and better beef at the same age. I can't see any Hereford faces here, Baba, Jabu said, looking out for the distinctive white face and flat forehead of a Hereford. I decided against it, the old man continued. That same week that I made that decision, a young man from near Gwanda, Mr. Len Harvey, he came to see me. He was interesting. He worked for the Department of Agriculture in the 1920s, when they were drawing up these plans and advising African farmers to crossbreed with European cattle. Mr. Harvey thought it was more important to keep the strain of the original Sanda cattle strong, because they were designed for our climate. So after some time, the government agreed and allocated 3,000 acres in the reserve to help him get a breeding program started. This was to improve the quality of the tuli so that the European farmers would appreciate them as a worthwhile pure breed of beef cattle for our climate. After about 20 years of breeding up the very best tuli cattle, they came here to Ntabazinduna to encourage me to take some of them and to develop and improve our herd. So, he said with a proud flourish, today I have a herd of nearly 200 pure tuli cattle. Just look at them, Jabu Rizani. Magnificent. Jabu couldn't help but be impressed. The cattle were strong and well fed. As always, their eyes watched everything they did, and curious young ones came up to suck your fingers. Now that their horn buds were burnt, he did miss the great horns that he'd known as a child. Beautiful horns, framing delicately soft native cattle noses and huge, gentle brown eyes. It has not been easy, grandfather was still talking, because the bulls from the Angoni next door kept jumping the fence onto the tuli calves that Mr. Harv gave me. So every time that happened, I had to send the babies away cheaply. Many times, I thought it was too hard to keep up. But all the time, I knew Len Harvey was right in what he believed. Now, my problem is making sure I know from the ear tags which cow has been made pregnant by which bull. I don't like keeping records because I want to be with my cattle, not with writing records. Perfect, Jabulani thought. Baba, I know a man, an excellent record keeper. He would do that for you. His name is Mantla Moyo. Do you have a job for him? So, Mantla Moyo was employed as head of administration on Baba Mkulu's farm at Ntabazinduna. The beautiful Bongani came with him, of course, and she went to school. Right now, she was writing exams. And I will get these O-levels with matriculation exemption, she had written in her last letter, so nobody can say I copied anything, even you, Jabulani Ngube. Oh, he was aching to see that cheeky girl again, and sad that his Bulawayo life had been too busy to see her for a whole year. The bus was still nowhere in sight, so Jabu thought he would cross the road to the milk bar to get a drink for the journey. As he reached the other side, he saw someone he thought he recognized and called out, Aidan? Aidan! It's Jabu! The man in front turned round. It was Aidan. Jabu worried that it might be someone else, because a black man shouting at a white man could be dangerous. Aidan, what happened when you had that fight with Mr. Eddington? Why did you leave? I hate working there without you to talk to. Aidan looked sad. I don't want to leave, Jabu. But where I come from, you don't find out about injustice and just put up with it. So when Mr. Eddington refused to raise your pay a bit more, I shouted at him, and he fired me. Oh, Aidan, that's terrible. Jabu saw the bus approaching, but it was too late to run back across the road and catch it. This was more important. I was just going to get a milkshake. We need to talk. Aidan had lost his job. Jabu had got a rise. Jabu bought Aidan a milkshake. But even buying Aidan a milkshake didn't make him happier. What happened? Aidan looked away. Aidan, you are my friend. I want to know what's wrong so I can help. Oh, you can't help me, Jabu. But perhaps if I help you, you can help yourself and others. Jabu nodded, then waited for Aidan to continue, because something was difficult for him to say. I told him you'd showed me the letter. He got furious and shouted that nobody was allowed to discuss what they earned with anyone else. Jabu was uncomfortable. Others in the milk bar were looking at them because Aidan was nearly shouting. He put his fingers to his lips, cautioning him, "Speak softer." I told him that he had better look at your salary again. I waited to keep quiet. This made him really mad. He shouted, "You bloody Englishman, come out here. You don't understand the situation. What right do you have to interfere?" Aidan stopped and a big grin came over his face. He called me a bloody Englishman, so I shouted, "I'm not a bloody Englishman, I'm a bloody Irishman." I thought he was going to burst, because he was so angry. Jabu stared at him in shock as the implications of all Aidan had said sank in. "Oh, I'm so sorry." "Well, I'm not Jabu." As I left, Mr. Eddington shouted I couldn't expect a reference from prisons, and that he would make sure all government departments knew I was a troublemaker. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know. I don't have enough money to go back to Ireland." "Eden, I'm on my way to Ntabazinduna to help my grandfather with his cattle sale. Why don't you come too?" And so they went to the cattle sale, talking all the way to Ntabazinduna. Aidan never stopped talking or asking questions. The bus dropped them off about a mile from Babankulu's house. It was harvest time, so the road was bustling with bulging Scotch carts and chattering women balancing huge, carefully cut bundles of wood or baskets of mealies on their heads, most with babies on their backs as well. Aidan went up and shook hands with them, with all of them, even with people Jabu didn't know who just happened to be walking along. Aidan wanted to shake hands with everyone, so it took a long time to walk home. "Aidan, is that what you would do if you walked down the streets in Belfast?" "What do you mean?" Aidan asked. "Shake hands and talk to everyone." "Oh, probably not everyone, but just as Africa. And I wanted them to know I liked him." "You're trying too hard, my friend," Jabu laughed. "Just be normal. They're up feeling awkward. The women are laughing, but they're also embarrassed. Shaking hands is your custom, not ours." "Ah, sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing and being friendly." "It was friendly, but it wasn't right. Don't worry, I will teach you, particularly the traditional greeting of the chief, because you'll need that when you meet my Babankulu. Respect and understanding is important in our culture too." Aidan looked so ashamed. Jabu pushed his shoulder hard and they nearly fell over. They ended up laughing as they turned into the gate of grandfather's house. Kanyiso was waiting for them, relieved that Jabu had at last arrived. "And who is this?" Kanyiso asked, as father and son exchanged greetings. "This is my friend Aidan, Baba. He's an Irishman." Aidan looked at Jabu anxiously. "Do I shake hands with your father?" Everybody laughed. And Kanyiso extended his hand to welcome the boy to his home. He did have an awful lot to learn. The next day they didn't have time for learning because they were so busy talking business. How many of the best weaners they could afford to sell, how many heifers they could keep for breeding. There were three classes of buyer. Most would be white commercial farmers from Gwanda, Nyamaplovo, Dupani. Then there'd be those who wanted to fatten weaners for sale to the Cold Storage Commission. They'd probably pay the best because CSC looked just at the beef, but farmers were still not quite sure about buying live African cattle. Then there were those who wanted to crossbreed with the European cattle, and one or two who wanted to do the same as his grandfather and develop the Tuli brand. It was this fourth group that Jabu's grandfather was most interested in. And it was an important sale, because 2 years ago the government stopped all price controls and had started free cattle sales to all people. As the local chief, it was important for Babankulu not only to get good prices, but also to show that African farming was as good as European farming. There was a lot of pride at stake. Babankulu had not sold at these free markets before, so everything had to be just right. At last, 98 animals were chosen for sale, which still left Babankulu with 80 breeding cows, some small calves and weaners, and 4 good bulls. Jabu, many cousins, and Aden spent the day making new holding pens, using old wooden poles collected over several months. They lashed them together with rimpi and strong string painted with tar to fix and strengthen it. Then they made passages with ramps so the cattle could be driven out of the paddocks and loaded into trucks. The animals had been dipped a week ago and had all the certificates to say so. Now the grooming could start. The cousins laughed at the idea of brushing mombies, but by the end of the day they were washing them down, cleaning their hoofs and legs to keep them free of dung and dirt, wiping their eyes and brushing them all over. The cattle were not used to it either. Some of them were skittish and jumping, while others stood with eyes half closed, enjoying the brushing. They started work before 5 that morning, so when Jabu's mother came out to the cattle yards, bringing tin cups of tea and fat slices of bread with dripping, it vanished into ravenous young stomachs. By 3 o'clock, huge trucks arrived, and there was a great shouting and noise as each animal was bundled in. Some cousins left with the trucks to unload the cattle in the big collecting ring at the showgrounds. So next morning, before the sun was up, the old farm truck groaned away, objecting to its load of 15 people sitting on the sides of the tray, on the tray itself, on the cab roof, while another 3 squeezed in next to the driver in front. There was a lot of gear changing and crashing, double declutching, before it moved up some of the hills leading to the cattle market. Jabu and Aden had jumped up to get a good place on the back of the truck so they could be the first off. They all sang their way to the sale pens, telling stories about the character of each of the cattle who had been chosen. When they arrived, they took turns driving one animal at a time into a locked pen where they were examined by vets. The animals were weighed and graded, a minimum price agreed and called out, then this would be written down against the number of the animal. Then they'd be ready to start the bidding. Jabu loved it. Hundreds of people busy, everyone knowing what they were doing, whips cracking to the guiding whistles and shouts of the umfans as they led their great beasts through dust-filled air. The cattle showed the whites of their eyes at all the pandemonium and people, until at last they moved into the cool of roofed cattle pens. Before Babankulu's herd was led out into the open area for auction, Nkanyiswa was given a loud hailer and invited to tell the story of the breeding of the Tuli herd and the links to Mr. Harvey. He finished by saying that his father, Chief Mekluli, hoped that most of these beautiful animals would go to farmers who also wanted to work to retain the integrity of the Tuli brand. The cousins started to lead the cattle into the auction area. The farmers got more and more excited by the quality of the animals they could see. Most animals had been given a minimum price that surprised Babankulu, as it was already so high, and he was worried it would mean that nobody would buy at that price. But when the auction started, the bids went higher and higher and on and on. Jabu watched as his Babankulu stood, looking bewildered by it all. The old man couldn't speak. He kept shaking his head, when on average the price was 28% higher even than the highest price recommended. Usually farmers paid the minimum price if they could, so this was unimaginable. Jabulani felt his heart bursting with pride and happiness for this stately old chief. After the sales, Babankulu and Nkanyiswa were thronged by black and white farmers who wanted to come out to Ntabazunduna another time and see the farm. They were interested to know how they could work together and wanted to talk about implementing new breeding programs. Hell, man, look at that bull, not even a year old. Yeah, I just bought 40 weaners. So you were the one who was bidding against me. Never seen Tuli with such great hindquarters. Jabu stood nearby in case they needed help and listened to everything that was said. He watched as his Babankulu turned to a tall, thin man trying to get his attention. They shook hands. Then the man's eyes misted up, and he put his arm round Babankulu's shoulders. Jabulani, his father Gran, turned round to him. I want you to remember this man. This is Len Harvey, the one who has worked with me on these Turi cattle. Come and shake his hand." As he went over to shake his hand, Jabu was quite certain he'd remember this man. "Your grandfather is exceptional, Jabulani," Len Harvey said, so ready to look critically at what I proposed, then to come back to me and say, "Okay, let's go." It's been tough for him. Many have said he was doing the wrong thing. But look at today. I am so pleased for him. Jabu absorbed everything. The excitement, the interaction between people, even the pride of the Umfans. He looked at the rows of people watching and leaning over the rails. Then he couldn't believe his eyes. He saw Mr. Davidson with Carol, and he was pretty sure with Pruden and Timber as well. He rushed over to them with much shaking of hands and shouts of laughter. Mr. Davidson was so pleased to see Jabu, and he called out to Nkanyiso, "Now I know why I haven't been able to get hold of you." They shook hands and clapped each other on the back. "What a magnificent herd, Nkanyiso. Please congratulate your father for me." The two men went off deep in conversation. Angus knew he'd have to get round to telling Nkanyiso about the bitter developments of the African Affairs Board, but not just yet. As they left the group, Nkanyiso shouted back to the four friends, "There's a bright out place tonight. See you there." They all decided that would be a great place for them to catch up as well. When the sales were over, Jabu felt a strange sense of loss. He knew his Babankulu would be feeling the same. He loved his cattle so much. Jabu watched him moving among them, talking, stroking their heads. He knew and loved the character of each one of them. Jabu went to stand with his Babankulu. They didn't talk. The old man put his hand on his grandson's shoulder, and they stood wrapped in each other's mix of emotions. Jabu suddenly remembered Aiden, took his leave, assuring his Babankulu he'd be at the evening festivities, and found Aiden talking to a young blonde farmer. They seemed to have a lot in common. He shouted out, "Hope you've been okay, Aiden. Sorry I've neglected you." Aiden laughed and said he'd had a great day. Jabu understood why when he was introduced to another bloody Irishman. He told Adelaide about the braai tonight and asked the farmer if he would like to join them, but he had to get home to Nyamatlovo. Jabu allowed himself to think at last of Bongani. They'd be meeting soon. He wanted to introduce her to Carol. As they talked, what Aiden told him yesterday suddenly hit him. He was still paid less than a white man who was now doing a lesser job. That hurt. A slow discontent settled deep inside him. Why, when things could work so well with Baba Mkulu's cattle sales, did the prisons department pay him less just because he was black? It was time for thought, and Jabu was far away. He found himself unconsciously drawing more sharp-pointed stars, which he must remember to add to his SRANC notebook. He also drew very carefully a big heart next to the name, Len Harvey. Well, to end a fascinating story, a few weeks ago I met another remarkable cattleman, Jack Milbank, who's breeding up cattle from Len Harvey's Sanger bloodline in Queensland, Australia. What a wonderful world, and how wonderful to see those cattle there. This is, as I said, the end of the current series, but it's been great being with you, and I've loved all the responses I've had. Thank you. It's been great. And there will be more later, but I must get on with book 2. And could I just ask you to subscribe by clicking that photograph? It just means then you'll get a message if I put anything up on YouTube that you might enjoy. But once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I might start to get a little share of the advertising revenue that these video logs are already supporting. I think I'm around the sort of 960 mark at the moment, so not got far to go. And every little helps. I hope you've enjoyed the series. I've had several requests for a similar reading of excerpts from Beloved African. So depending on how book 2 gets on, that might well come up next. Thank you for joining me.